Think you're brave? Spend a night guarding places the world forgot, where silence is broken only by things that shouldn't be there. If you dare to feel true dread, then buckle up, because I'm about to tell you exactly why I'll never look at shadows the same way again. There's a certain kind of person who takes the graveyard shift. Maybe you're a night owl, maybe you need the money, or maybe you just like the idea of being the only one awake, while the rest of the world sleeps. For me, it was a mix of all three. I'd worked security for years, warehouses, empty office parks, even a few hospitals. But nothing prepared me for the night I was called to guard the old Marrowby textile mill. It started with a phone call just after midnight. I was halfway through a cup of stale coffee, feet up on the desk, watching the clock crawl toward morning. My supervisor's number flashed on my phone. He never called unless something was wrong. "Hey, you up for a last-minute shift?" He asked, not bothering with small talk. "We've got a situation at Marrowby Mill. The alarm's been tripping all night. Cops checked it out, but they want someone on site until sunrise. You'll get double pay." I hesitated. Everyone in town knew the mill. It had been abandoned for decades, a hulking brick skeleton on the edge of the industrial district. Kids dared each other to break in on Halloween, and old-timers swapped stories about the place being haunted. I'd always written it off as small-town gossip, but the idea of spending a night alone in that place made my skin crawl. Still, double pay was double pay. I told myself it was just another building, just another shift. I grabbed my flashlight, my radio, and my keys, and headed out into the night. The drive to Marrowby was short, but every mile felt longer than the last. The streets were empty, the only light coming from flickering street lamps and the occasional passing car. As I turned onto the road that led to the mill, the city seemed to fall away behind me. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed in. The mill loomed ahead, a massive, crumbling structure surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The windows were broken, the bricks stained with decades of rain and neglect. Weeds grew waist-high around the loading docks. And the old Sin Marrowby textile hung crooked above the main entrance, its letters faded and peeling. I parked my car under a busted streetlight and sat for a moment, engine idling. The building looked even worse up close. The kind of place where you could believe anything might be hiding inside. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just nerves. I'd done this 100 times before. Out! But as I stepped out of the car, the feeling only grew stronger, and the night was too quiet, the air too still. Even the usual city sounds, distant traffic, barking dogs seemed to have vanished. All I could hear was the crunch of gravel under my boots and the faint hum of the wind. I walked up to the gate, fumbling with the padlock. My hands felt clumsy, colder than they should have been. The lock finally gave way with a metallic snap, and I pushed the gate open, its hinges shrieking in protest. The mill's main entrance was a set of heavy double doors, one hanging off its hinges. I shined my flashlight inside, the beam cutting through the darkness. Dust motes danced in the air, swirling in the light. The smell hit me immediately, a mix of mold, old wood, and something sour, like rotting fabric. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The first thing that struck me was the size of the place. The main floor stretched out in front of me, a vast open space littered with broken machinery and piles of debris. The ceiling was high, crisscrossed with rusted beams and sagging pipes. My footsteps echoed, each one sounding too loud in the emptiness. I did a quick sweep of the ground floor, checking the doors and windows. Everything was locked up tight, just as the cops had said. I radioed my supervisor to let him know I was on site, then settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet night. But as I stood there, flashlight in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked the perimeter, shining my light into every corner. The shadows seemed to move just out of reach, shifting as I passed. I told myself it was just my imagination, the tricks of light and darkness in a place that hadn't seen life in years. But the unease wouldn't go away. I paused by a row of old offices, their doors hanging open, desks and chairs scattered like the aftermath of a storm. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was thick with dust. I could see my footprints trailing behind me, the only sign that anyone had been here in a long time. I checked my watch. Only 20 minutes had passed since I arrived, but it felt like hours. I tried to focus on the job, check the doors, check the windows, make sure no one had broken in. But every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see someone or something waiting for me. I made my way back to the main entrance, planning to do another sweep. As I passed the old break room, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around, flashlight raised, but there was nothing there. Just a broken chair and a pile of empty soda cans. I laughed nervously, the sound echoing off the walls. "Get a grip," I muttered. "It's just an old building." But as I stood there, listening to the silence, I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to keep moving, checking each room in turn. The further I went, the heavier the air seemed to get. The smell of decay grew stronger, and the darkness felt thicker, almost alive. By the time I finished my first round, I was sweating, despite the cold. I radioed in again, my voice sounding thin and shaky. "All clear," I said, trying to sound confident, but I knew deep down that something was off. I took a seat on an old crate near the entrance, trying to calm my nerves. But as I sat there, listening to the building settle around me, I realized the night was just beginning, and whatever was waiting inside Marrowby Mill, I was about to find out. I had just wrapped up my first round when it hit Mitha. Real challenge wasn't just staying awake, but staying sane too. The deeper I went into Marrowby Mill, the more it felt like the building itself was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I sat for a while on that old crate, trying to convince myself the worst was over. But the silence pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant drip of water. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it felt like the shadows were swallowing the light as fast as I could shine it. Eventually, I stood up and forced myself to keep moving. I knew if I stayed in one place too long, my nerves would get the better of me. I started my second patrol, this time venturing deeper into the mill. The first steps inside were the hardest. The smell of decay was stronger, hair mold, old oil, and something else, something sour and almost metallic. Every breath felt thick, like I was breathing in the history of the place. My boots crunched on broken glass and debris, and every step echoed off the high, empty ceiling. I passed through the main floor, weaving between rusted machines and toppled shelves. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, swirling in the cold air. The silence was so complete that even the smallest sound, a pebble skittering across the floor, the soft thud of my own heartbeat, felt deafening. Checked the old offices again, shining my light into each empty room. The desks were covered in dust, papers scattered like someone had left in a hurry decades ago. In one office, a calendar still hung on the wall, frozen in time, October 1987. I wondered what the last person to leave this place had been thinking. Did they know they'd never come back? The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The building seemed to stretch on forever, each hallway leading to another darker corridor. I tried to keep track of my route, but the sameness of the rooms and the endless shadows made it easy to get turned around. As I moved through the mill, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like there were eyes in the darkness, just out of reach of my flashlight. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, just the way old buildings play tricks on your mind. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I started to notice subtle shifts in the air. A sudden, inexplicable draft would brush past me, cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. Sometimes I'd hear a faint noise, a soft tapping, a distant thud, the whisper of fabric moving in the dark. Every time I stopped to listen, the sound would fade, leaving only silence behind. I tried to focus on the job. I checked the doors, made sure the windows were still locked, and radioed in every half hour. But each time I spoke, my voice sounded smaller, swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the mill. The normal patrol became anything but normal. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, shining my light into corners I'd already checked. The feeling of isolation grew heavier with every step. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself it was all in my head, I found the first undeniable sign that something was off. I was walking down a narrow hallway lined with storage rooms, the kind where they used to keep spare parts and cleaning supplies. Most of the doors were closed, but one was slightly ajar. I remembered checking it earlier and finding it locked. I pushed the door open with my foot, shining my flashlight inside. The room was empty except for a few broken crates and a mop bucket. But the air was colder here, and the smell of decay was stronger than anywhere else in the building. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft click behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, and saw the door slowly swinging shut on its own. I lunged forward and caught it before it closed, my hands shaking. I tried to laugh at old buildings settle, doors move with drafts. But as I stepped back into the hallway, I realized there was no draft. The air was perfectly still. I kept moving, but the sense of unease grew with every step. The building felt alive, like it was breathing around me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I finished my patrol and made my way back to the main entrance, my nerves frayed. Checked my watch, still hours to go before sunrise. I radioed in, trying to sound calm, but my voice was tight. "All clear," I said, but I didn't believe it. I sat down again, this time near the front doors, and tried to steady my breathing. But the silence was different now. It wasn't just empty, it was expectant, like the building was waiting for something to happen. I thought about calling my supervisor, making up an excuse to leave early. But I knew I couldn't. I had a job to do, and I was in tea about to let a few creaky doors and cold drafts get the better of me. Still, as I sat there, flashlight in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the isolation and the darkness playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew the night was far from over. The real horror was just beginning, and whatever was inside Marrowby Mill, it was about to make itself known. I tried to convince myself it was just nerves, just the old building playing tricks on me. But as the hours dragged on, the line between imagination and reality started to blur. That's when the uninvited guest made itself known. I sat near the main entrance, flashlight in hand, trying to steady my breathing. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or a distant thud, but I told myself it was just the building settling. I checked my watch, still hours to go before sunrise. I decided to do another patrol, hoping movement would calm my nerves. I started with the offices, shining my light into each empty room. The dust was undisturbed, my footprints the only sign of life. I moved on to the storage hallway, the one with the door that had closed on its own. The air was colder there, and the smell of decay was stronger than ever. As I passed the storage room, I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised, but the hallway was empty. I waited, heart pounding, but the sound didn't come again. I kept moving, checking the windows and doors, making sure everything was still locked. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, like eyes were following me from the shadows. That's when the real strangeness began. I was walking past the old break room when I heard a door creak open behind me. I turned, expecting to see nothing, but one of the office doors was slowly swinging open. I'd checked it earlier, it had been closed tight. I walked over, pushed the door open with my foot, and shined my light inside. The room was empty, just a broken chair and a pile of old papers. I stepped inside, looking for any sign of what might have moved the door, but there was nothing. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft thud behind me. I spun around, and the chair was now facing the door. I was sure it had been facing the window when I walked in. My skin crawled. I backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I'd remembered it wrong. But deep down I knew something was off. I made my way back to the main floor, my nerves fraying with every step. I passed the row of old lockers near the loading dock, and as I did, one of the locker doors swung open with a metallic clang. I jumped, nearly dropping my flashlight. I walked over, heart pounding, and shined my light inside. The locker was empty, but the door kept swinging, creaking on its hinges. I reached out to close it, but as soon as my hand touched the metal, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled my bones. I stumbled back, breath coming in short gasps. I wanted to run, to get out of the building, and never look back. But I had a job to do. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be an explanation.
Ow.
But the building wasn't done with me yet. I started to hear footsteps, soft, shuffling steps, like someone walking barefoot on the dusty floor. They echoed through the empty halls, sometimes close, sometimes far away. Every time I tried to follow the sound, it would fade, only to start up again somewhere else. I radioed my supervisor, trying to sound calm. "Everything's fine," I lied. Just the usual creaks and groans, but I knew I was lying to myself. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent. I heard doors creaking open and slamming shut, objects clattering to the floor in rooms I'd already checked. I started to feel like I was being herded, pushed toward the center of the building. That's when it happened, the moment that shattered any remaining skepticism. I was walking down the main hallway when I saw a figure at the far end. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by my flashlight. But as I watched, the figure moved slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the darkness and into the beam of my light. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, dressed in old, tattered work clothes. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were dark hollows. He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled a slow, unnatural smile that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure took a step toward me, then another. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. I wanted to run, to get out of the building and never look back. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure stopped a few feet away, still smiling, raised a hand as if to wave, and then he simply faded, away like a shadow dissolving in the light. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Was it just exhaustion, stress, or something else? I forced myself to move, to finish my patrol. But every step felt heavier, every shadow darker. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. I made my way back to the main entrance, my nerves shot. I wanted to leave, to call my supervisor and quit on the spot. But I knew I couldn't. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a ghost or whatever it was scare me off. I sat down near the front doors, flashlight in hand, and waited. The silence was different, now charged, electric, like the building was holding its breath. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the isolation and the darkness playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was not alone. The next hour would be the longest of my life. I'd faced fear before, but nothing like this, as the minutes crawled by. I realized the real test wasn't just surviving the night was surviving whatever was inside Marrowby Mill with me. I had seen things I could not explain, but the night wasn't over. The clock on my phone said it was just after 3 a.m., still an hour until sunrise. I'd never felt time move so slowly or fear so thick. I was trapped in Marrowby Mill, and whatever was in there with me wasn't finished yet. The longest hour. I sat on the cold concrete near the main entrance, my back pressed against the door as if that would keep anything out or in. My flashlight was clutched so tightly in my hand that my knuckles ached. I kept the beam pointed at the far end of the room, half expecting to see that pale figure step out of the shadows again. The silence was different now. It was not just empty. It was heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. Every sound, my own breathing, the faint hum of distant machinery. The occasional drip of water felt magnified, echoing through the vast, abandoned space. I tried to focus on my breathing, to slow my racing heart. I told myself I was safe, that I'd made it this far and just needed to hold out a little longer. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those hollow eyes, that unnatural smile. I checked my phone again. Only a few minutes had passed. Odd. Time seemed to crawl, each second stretching out longer than the last. I tried to distract myself by going over my training. I thought about the emergency exits, the layout of the building, the quickest way to get out if I needed to. But every plan I made seemed to fall apart in my mind, undone by the memory of that figure and the way the building seemed to shift around me. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deep inside the mill. I jumped to my feet, flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound was followed by a series of rapid, uneven footsteps, too fast, too erratic to be human. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. I forced myself to move to check the source of the noise. I crept down the hallway, every muscle tense, every sense on high alert. The beam of my flashlight danced across the walls, illuminating peeling paint, broken glass, and the endless shifting shadows. As I turned a corner, I heard a whisper, so soft I almost missed it. It sounded like my name, carried on a breath of cold air. I spun around, but there was no one there. I kept moving, my nerves fraying with every step. I passed the row of lockers, the break room, the storage hallway. Everything looked the same, but felt different, like the building was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached the far end of the mill, where the old loading docks were. The doors were chained shut, but one of them was rattling, as if something was trying to get an oar out. I shined my light on the door, but the chains held fast. I turned to leave, but froze. In the reflection of a broken window, I saw the figure again standing just behind me, its face inches from mine. I spun around, but the space was empty. Heart hammered in my chest. I stumbled back toward the main floor, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was haunting the mill. As I passed the offices, I heard the sound of papers rustling, drawers slamming shut, and the faint, rhythmic tapping of fingers on a desk. I peeked inside one of the rooms and saw the chair spinning slowly, as if someone had just stood up. I backed away, not daring to turn my back on the room. I made my way to the center of the mill, where the old machines stood like rusted skeletons. The air was colder here, and the darkness felt thicker, almost suffocating. I tried to radio my supervisor, but all I got was static. I was truly alone. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I paced the main floor, flashlight sweeping back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye's shadow darting across the wall, a flicker of movement behind a pile of debris. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just exhaustion, stress, the power of suggestion. Maybe the stories about Marrowby Mill had gotten into my head, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone. Then, as the clock crept toward for a I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the empty building. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, animal and yet not. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floor and walls. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. The growl grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised, and saw the figure standing at the far end of the room. It was closer now, its features clearer in the beam of my light. The eyes were empty, the mouth twisted into a snarl. It started to move toward me, slow at first, then faster. I stumbled back, tripping over a piece of debris, my flashlight skittering across the floor. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran for the main entrance. The footsteps followed, echoing through the darkness, growing louder with every step. I reached the doors, fumbling with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. Finally, the lock gave way and I burst outside, gulping in the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I sat there for a long time, shaking, trying to catch my breath. The mill loomed in the darkness, silent once more. I'd survived the night, but I knew I'd never be the same. The things I'd seen, the fear I'd felt, it all stayed with me, long after I left Marrowby Mill behind. But the story doesn't end there. The real impact came after, in the days and nights that followed. I made it out of Marrowby Mill, but the fear didn't stay behind. Sometimes the scariest part of a haunting IS&T, what happens in the moment, what follows you home. Aftermath and reflection, I sit in my car for a long time, hands shaking on the steering wheel, staring at the dark outline of the mill in my rearview mirror. My breath fogged the glass, and my heart still hammered in my chest. I kept expecting to see that pale figure step out of the shadows, to hear the echo of footsteps on the gravel. But the night was silent, and the only thing moving was the wind. I tried to convince myself it was over. I'd survived. I'd done my job. But as I drove away, every streetlight seemed to flicker. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer. I kept glancing in the rear view, half expecting to see someone following me. When I got home, I locked every door and window, something I'd never bothered with before. I left the lights on in every room. I even slept with my flashlight on the nightstand, just in case. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those hollow eyes, that twisted smile. I heard the growl, the footsteps, the whisper of my name in the dark. The next morning, I called my supervisor and told him I wouldn't be taking any more shifts at Marrowby Mill. He didn't ask why. Maybe he'd heard stories before, or maybe he could hear the fear in my voice. Either way, He just said, "Understood," and that was that. But the mill stayed with me. For days, I jumped at every unexpected sound. I avoided dark hallways and empty buildings. Even at work, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow move where it shouldn't. I tried to talk myself out of it. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just the power of suggestion. I'd heard the stories, let them get into my head, and my mind had filled in the blanks. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. I knew I'd never look at abandoned places the same way again. A week later, I ran into another guard who'd worked the mill years before. We were both on break, sipping coffee in the early morning quiet. I asked him, half joking, if he'd ever seen anything strange at Marrowby. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That place isn't right. I saw things too. Heard things. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." He told me his own story about doors slamming, voices whispering, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. He said he'd lasted 2 nights before he refused to go back. "Some places," he said, "just hold on to things. Bad things." That conversation helped a little. It meant I wasn't alone. But it also meant the fear was real, and it wasn't just in my head. I started reading up on the mill's history. Turns out Marrowby had a reputation long before I ever set foot inside. There were stories of accidents, of workers who died on the job, of a fire that had swept through the building decades ago. Some said the place was cursed, that the spirits of the dead still wandered the halls, looking for a way out. I don't know if I believe in curses, but I do believe in what I saw. I know I'll never forget that night. Even now, months later, I still get chills when I think about it. Sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet building, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes I'll hear a whisper, or a door will close just a little too softly. And every time, I remember Marrowby Mill and the lesson it taught me. I learned that fear isn't always about what's in front of you. Sometimes, it's about what you can't see, what you can't explain. It's about the things that follow you home, the memories that linger long after the night is over. I also learned to trust my instincts. If a place feels wrong, it probably is. If you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. And if you ever find yourself alone in a place the world has forgotten, remember you might not be as alone as you think. I want to hear from you. Have you ever worked a night shift in a place that felt off? Have you ever seen or heard something you just can't explain? Share your story in the comments below. Let's see how many of us have felt that same chill, that same sense of being watched by something we can't see. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true horror from the shadows. This is Nightmaze, where the darkness is never empty, and the scariest stories are the ones that stay with you.